So hello, everyone. My name is Keren Yarhi-Milo. I am a professor in political science department at SIPA, and I'm the director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And it's great to have so many of you with us today for a co-sponsored event on co-sponsored with between the Saltzman Institute and Columbia, Harvard, China and the World Program, and here at Columbia University. And it is great to have so many of you to talk today, to be with us to talk today about foreign policy challenges for the Biden administration. I think we were a little bit ambitious there with the title. We only have an hour and a half, so evidently we'll be able to talk about some of the challenges that the Biden administration will is likely to face. We have great panel for you today. We have our own Professor Stephen Biddle, Tom Christensen, Steve Sestanovich, and yours truly. And this event will be moderated by Professor Jack Snyder, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Relations in the Political Science Department, is a member of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace. He's the author of many books and articles on democratization and war, imperial overstretch, war crimes, tribunals, and other international security topics. He has a forthcoming book, and congratulations, Jack, Human Rights for Pragmatist Social Power in Modern Times, that is coming out with Princeton University Press this year. And I'm very happy to have him and all my colleagues today to talk about this important topic. So I will turn to Professor Snyder to kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Keren. It certainly is true that the Biden administration is facing more than its share of challenges on the home front and also on foreign policy. People are comparing these challenges facing Biden to those facing Franklin Delano Roosevelt upon taking office. But Biden has it even worse. He has to be Dr. New Deal and Dr. Win the War at the same time and more. We won't cover all of this on our panel, which will mainly look at regional security challenges, drawing on the very deep expertise of our 4 Columbia colleagues. But it'll be good to keep in mind the overall picture of Biden's daunting to-do list. So at the top of the list is to defeat the pandemic globally. And the South Africa variant reminds us that the coronavirus is a global challenge that can't be solved just in one place without thinking about the globe as a whole. Secondly, Biden has been talking about the need to act boldly to restart the economy. And he said that what he means by that is to restart the world economy. So one question that looms over our discussion today is whether the endless printing of money by the United States can provide the resources to tackle the entire to-do list of foreign challenges that his administration faces. As the late Everett Dirksen used to say, a trillion here, a trillion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. The third big issue is the goal of making dramatic headway on climate change. And this has to be done with not a single vote to spare in the US Senate, and as yet, no international coalition to support that ambitious goal. So these first 3 global challenges provide the context for the regional security challenges that are going to be our main focus today. Now, a 4th gigantic challenge that we will address is to contain the dangers of China's rise while retaining its possible benefits. Biden's team sees strong US allies all pulling together as a crucial means to win the battle for technology dominance and to even up the playing field in trade. But will the allies agree to push back against China on economic issues? And for its part, will the US agree to trade agreements with allies that provide them with an alternative to their business dealings with China? On the security front, what will it take to keep frictions over the South China Sea, Hong Kong, and so-called Uyghur genocide from blowing the lid off before the more slow-moving elements of technological and economic strategy can start to produce results that are positive in the US-Chinese relationship? Now, other regional security problems may not be quite so world-rocking as these four issues that I've just mentioned, but several of them are dangerous enough so that they could derail progress on the big four. Potential complications that we'll discuss in detail today emanate from such sources as Russia, Iran, the Taliban, the successors to ISIS, the newly designated pariah, Saudi Arabia, and maybe even those progressive idealists who want to boycott the Beijing Olympics. Maybe even they could be spoilers of the agenda. So to talk about these issues today, we have an all-star cast. First, we're going to discuss with Thomas J. Christensen, who's the professor of public and international affairs and director of the China and the World program at Columbia. From 2006 and 2008, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. His research and teaching focus on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security more generally. You should read his recent book on all of that, The China Challenge. I want to say that I owe Tom a debt for having been my co-author on one of my most cited articles. Thanks a lot, Tom. Also on our panel, after Tom, we'll talk with Stephen Sestanovich, the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Professor of International Affairs and an affiliate of the Saltzman Institute. His research interests include Soviet and East European studies, strategic planning and international studies, and foreign policy. Steve served as ambassador at large and special advisor to the Secretary of State on the newly independent states, and served as a principal spokesman for the administration and the State Department before Congress and the public on policy towards the newly independent states. Steve has, over the years, been kind enough to invite me to serve on panels in his grand, big SEPA class, introducing the new SEPA students to the mysteries of international relations, where he peppers me with questions on a panel. And so this time we're switching seats and I get to pepper him. Third up, we'll have Stephen Biddle, who's the professor of international and public affairs at Columbia, adjunct senior fellow for defense policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served on the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board, on General Petraeus's Joint Strategic Assessment Team in Baghdad in 2007, and a senior advisor to the Central Command Assessment Team in Washington in 2008 and 2009, as well as a member of General McChrystal's Initial Strategic Assessment Team in Kabul in 2009. So when he talks to us about Afghanistan shortly, you know he knows what he's talking about because he's been there and done that. He lectures regularly at the U.S. Army War College and other military schools, has testified before Congress on the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, on force planning and net assessment and European arms control. Thanks for being with us, Steve. And finally, we'll go back to Keren. Keren Yarhi-Milo is the director of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies at Columbia. Her research and teaching focus on international relations and foreign policy, with a specialization on international security, including foreign policy decision-making, crisis bargaining, intelligence, and US policy in the Middle East. Her first book from Princeton University Press, Knowing the Adversary, won the Furness Award for the best book in the field of international security. And her recent book, Who Fights for Reputation, carries on the glorious tradition of the Columbia Political Science Department as the Mecca for psychological theories of international relations, established by Bob Jervis, our colleague. So let me begin by raising the question of the Biden administration's and the coming relationship with China. And so, Tom, to ask a simple but complicated question, do you expect dramatic differences between the Trump and the Biden approaches to China? Or do you also expect some similarities?
Thanks, Jack. Thanks to Keren for hosting this and allowing China and the World to be a co-host. We're really proud to be associated with the event. And I think that there'll be more similarities than people might expect between the Biden administration's approach to China and the Trump administration's approach, but there will be some significant differences as well. On the economics front, which is really where things start, the Trump administration raised real issues that we had with China before the Trump administration and that many other advanced economies have with China. Issues related to intellectual property rights, rip-offs, subsidies to state-owned enterprises that create unfair playing fields, closure of certain sections of the Chinese market to foreign competition. So all those things were real. I think the difference is I don't think you'll see the Biden administration adopting sweeping tariffs as an approach to these problems, but they probably will use the existing tariffs that they inherited from the Trump administration as leverage in trying to negotiate with China on some of these very real issues. The one place where I think there's likely to be a lot of similarity between the Biden administration and the Trump administration on economics is in the area of 5G and artificial intelligence. I think you're going to have a pretty much a near zero-sum struggle between the United States and China. You know, they talk about strategic competition in both the Biden administration and the Trump administration. This is one area where I think there's going to be overlap. And I expect there to be pretty strict export controls on US businesses that supply important parts into the Chinese industries on 5G and artificial intelligence, in part because those those industries also have security spinoffs and implications for the next generation of weapon systems. So I don't expect that to change very much. I expect the Biden administration to be pretty tough on China's assertive behavior and its sovereignty disputes in the East China Sea with Japan, across the Taiwan Strait, and in the South China Sea with multiple disputants. I don't think there'll be a big change there, but I think there'll be a much heavier emphasis, as you suggested, on alliances and partnerships in dealing with China in those areas. And there's already been an impact in a place like Southeast Asia simply by President Biden winning the election. The reputation of the United States, the confidence in the United States in Southeast Asia as a security guarantor has increased markedly. The Trump administration did some real damage on that score to America's reputation in the region. So I expect an emphasis there, but there's one real catch, Jack, and that is that the region has moved forward on multilateral trade agreements and investment agreements in a major way while the United States was absent in the last 4 years. And to really build alliances and partnerships, particularly in East Asia, you have to have an economic component to your diplomacy. And one of the things that makes me nervous is the Biden administration has signaled a kind of traditional Democratic Party view on multilateral trade and investment agreements that suggests that they don't really want to pursue those. So Jake Sullivan has said that he thinks previous deals have helped businesses and investors, but not workers. This is a kind of traditional position. I don't agree with that position, but it's a powerful position within the administration. And one of the interesting things to see, Jack, is whether the desire to build those alliances and those partnerships is strong enough to get the administration over its allergy to engage on things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other economic deals in the region, because they realize that they really need those as an underpinning for their relationship. One of the things that we saw just today is the JCPOA, the Iran deal. The Biden administration is going to be much more multilateral than the Trump administration. That's not a high bar, but there's a lot of institutions, the Paris Accords, the JCPOA, multilateral efforts on not just Iran, but maybe even North Korea as well, and the pandemic, and the World Health Organization, and I think increasingly the World Food Program in places like Africa, where the Biden administration is going to be more multilateral, and that will be a form of competition with China, because China's moved into the void that the Trump administration left in a lot of these institutions. But it's also an opportunity for cooperation, and this is the positive side of the coin. And that is that there's almost like kind of a McCarthyite view of China in the United States right now. So people are getting attacked for being pro-China or close to China. And the most dramatic example recently was the stalwart public official, Bill Burns, was attacked in conservative media circles for being attached to China through the Carnegie Endowment, where he was president. So that's the kind of environment we're in. So it's not good politics to be seen as cooperating with China, but if you can do it through multilateral institutions, you kind of have cover for it. So if you're cooperating with China on the pandemic through the World Health Organization, that's probably a good way to go. If you're cooperating through the JCPOA talks of P5+1, that's probably a good way to go rather than just bilaterally. And that can provide some cover. And then the last piece is human rights, and you touched on this in your excellent introduction. I think the Biden administration is going to be more sincere and more persistent in advancing US traditional human rights values in its foreign policy. There were episodes of this in the Trump administration, but they seemed kind of ad hoc and usually related to how much they wanted to punish China. So I think there'll be a more principled and more general approach in the Biden administration on this. But one of the big issues that's out there is the 2022 Winter Olympics. And it's just, one of those dumb luck issues in history that Beijing won this Olympics a while back. And you have a situation in which the Biden administration has agreed fully with the Trump administration, at least so far, that what is happening in Xinjiang, the repression in Xinjiang, which is very real and very serious, constitutes genocide. Personally, I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that designation, but it was designated as such in the last week of the Trump administration, and the Biden officials have also designated it as a genocide. I can't imagine if we as a country designate what's happening in Xinjiang as a genocide, that we would send an Olympic team to the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And I can't imagine that they wouldn't try to get other countries to go along with us. This will be really controversial and conflict provoking with China as a nation if it were to occur. And I don't see right now how we avoid that train wreck unless something changes, either in China's policy in Xinjiang or in the designation by the United States of what's happening in Xinjiang. But I think that that's a real train wreck waiting to happen. And I think it will affect all of the other things. One of the things we have to cooperate with in China, and we'll talk about this later, and I'll conclude with these comments, is non-proliferation. And China is by far Iran's biggest economic partner. If you want to pressure Iran, you have to talk to China. If you want to pressure North Korea, obviously, China is by far the biggest economic partner. So we're going to be talking with them about this, and it's going to be complicated if at the same time we are boycotting their Olympics. So I see all of these things sort of tied together. I don't know if it's a knot, but it's tied together. And I'll just stop there. Thanks for your patience.
Tom, I just have a quick question about the multilateral forums part of your argument and the global problems, pandemic, climate change. These all seem to be issues where China, at relatively little cost to its core interests, can be forthcoming and signal a major willingness to cooperate with the Biden administration's plans. Is that what you foresee? And will this cover the whole gamut of those issues? Or are they more likely to sit back and offer concessions and help piecemeal and reluctantly on this agenda?
I think it depends on the issue, not just whether it's multilateral or not. So I'm relatively optimistic that the pandemic provides some real opportunities for cooperation in places like Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, between the United States and China through the organizations, not bilaterally. It should be the case, right? It's been, I wrote about this during the pandemic, that I think considered a tragedy that it hasn't already happened. With clear common interest against a common adversary in the disease. A lot of experience in both countries in terms of logistics and other efforts in those developing world countries. And a real problem in that this is going to cause huge financial crises. It's going to cause hunger. My wife's worked in Malawi as a doctor, and Malawi's being hit very hard. And as you said in your introductory comments, unless we're all vaccinated and immune, none of us are safe, because you're going to have further and further mutations. So we have all these reasons to be cooperative. And I think that's why I'm more optimistic on an issue like that, where you have the institutions in place. Where I'm less optimistic is on issues like the JCPOA. Where the United States is viewed fairly widely around the world as the spoiler, the one that pulled out of the agreement. And China has brand new economic deals with Iran. And in the first JCPOA, one of the ways that we got the deal to be cut was that the use of secondary sanctions against partners of Iran in the economic sphere led them to cut back on their economic activities and increase the pressure on Tehran. I'm not so sure a country like China is going to be willing to cut back on its economic activity when the original deal collapsed because the US unilaterally pulled out, and when the United States is threatening Chinese firms in the future with secondary sanctions, which most Chinese elites believe are illegal under international law. So I think it's going to be a real challenge, and you have to go through China. And you have to get the Chinese on board if you want to use economic pressure on Iran, simply again, because China is by far the biggest economic partner of Iran in terms of investment, trade, in both directions, not just the purchase of fossil fuels, but the sale of consumer goods and everything else. So you have to go through China. And this is tied up with a whole range of issues that we don't have time to talk about, like the Madame Meng Wanzhou issue in Canada, which really started as a secondary sanction of sorts, in that Madame Meng was alleged to have done bank fraud about her relationship with Iran. So it's all kind of tied together in a lot of controversial political issues in the United States and in China.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for hitting all those big issues and for mentioning the headline issue of today's news, the JCPOA stuff, which we will come back to. So let's move on now to Steve Sestanovich. Steve, it's been a tradition in recent administrations to try to start off by hitting the reset button in relations with Russia, so-called. But a lot of people in Europe are now grumbling that Biden is taking a pretty hard line on some Russia-related issues. And what do you foresee in that regard? Will this cause friction with US allies?
Professor Sestanovich, you're muted.
You're mute, Steve.
Sorry. Thanks to you, Jack, and other participants. You're absolutely right about the way in which the administration has positioned itself in the early going in Russia policy. Biden spoke today at the Munich Security Conference, and a lot of his speech was addressed to, it was about Russia policy. The idea that the administration is going to pursue an early reset in the way that previous administrations had done with Russia is, I think, widely discounted, both by outside analysts and by the new appointees. And I think it's important to understand why that is. It's not just a kind of incorrigible hostility toward Russia, although that's certainly what Putin and his advisors say. All of these previous resets since the end of the Cold War were with a Russian leader who was kind of new in the job. Clinton with Yeltsin, Bush with Putin, Obama with Medvedev. And that involved a hope, led to a hope, that you could reshape the relationship through a kind of personal outreach to the Russian leader. Certainly Trump himself had that idea that you could personalize the relationship. Today, when people look at Russia, they don't see a leader who is ready to rethink the relationship, who's new on the job, learning his way as a player in international politics, but somebody with a long track record of egregious actions that American leaders have had to object to. And I think that means that in thinking about a new relationship with Putin, the Biden administration is going to have very low expectations. They've managed to deal with one problem right away, take the issue of renewing the New START treaty off the table by just saying, yes, we're not going to play any funny games the way that Trump people did about getting China in or extending it only for 1 year. They just said 5 years, we're done. We don't have to think about that again. And maybe there can be other arms control initiatives, but nothing is particularly urgent in the way that the extension of New START was. I think the second reason that you're going to find that the new administration doesn't want to start with outreach to Russia and figuring out how to launch a kind of reset is the idea that really you've got to begin elsewhere if you want to reshape Russian-American relations. And that is, you've got to begin with allies. You've got to reconstitute the international alignments that represent the best check and the best hope of getting a kind of reconsideration by Russia of their approach to the outside world. Question is, are you going to be able to do that in a way that creates a kind of effective set of coalitions against the Russians? And I think you're absolutely right that here's where the big challenges are. You are surely going to see continued pressure of the kind that the Trump, but also the Obama administration applied to getting European allies to build up their defenses to meet the 2% goal, 2% of GDP on military spending. But a lot of them aren't going to do that. A lot of them are going to be wary of American policy as launching a new arms race. So that will be, to start with, a kind of question is to, does the United States and Europe, do they have the same approach to security? Take another issue like Ukraine. One of the key issues that's up for decision in the early going of the administration is whether to make an all-out effort to block the Nord Stream pipeline as a way of keeping Ukraine less vulnerable to Russian cutoffs, reducing, preserving Ukraine's share of Russian energy transport earnings. A lot of Europeans are going to be unhappy with that. Take a third issue, cybersecurity, meddling, or broadly speaking, ideological divides that the United States has felt especially acutely in past years because of, especially starting with the 2016 election meddling case. Is the United States going to apply new sanctions to Russia, and is it going to find that European countries are prepared to go along? You know, I think this will be the focus of early going for the administration. Let me add just one other case where I think it's we're not talking about working with allies, but where creating an international alignment is crucial, and that's what Tom mentioned earlier, which is Iran. The Russians have a place at the table as envisioned or as reflecting the original JCPOA negotiations. And the question is, will they there be a spoiler, or will they contribute to a renewed agreement? I think the administration's view here is likely to be that Russian contributions to an agreement will not be very great, but that they won't stand in the way, and that the focus of Iran diplomacy will have to be more bilateral. So if you take all of this together, I think you see some challenges for the administration in building coalitions against Russia, but lower expectations about what you can expect to get from Russia. In some ways, I think the bottom line may be that Russia is a lower priority for the administration than it has been in our imagination and in the calculations of previous administrations.
So Steve, you talked about a bunch of issues that deal with concrete issues, security issues. But there's another dimension of the relationship between Biden and Putin's Russia that's problematic, which is the ideological competition between a President Biden who thinks of himself as reviving the liberal international order and Putin, who in recent years has staked his ideological position on being the leader of illiberal backlash against the predatory liberal order, something that has probably been reinforced in his thinking by Belarus and the protests against Lukashenko and the Navalny excitement of late. So this is a question about Putin's commitment to this illiberal ideological competition with the West, but it's also a question of how the Biden administration will position themselves as the standard bearers for liberal internationalism. After all, liberal internationalism over the last couple of decades has been associated with the forever wars and with globalization of the economy, which is seen as hurting American workers back at home. So first of all, will Biden be able to come up with like a new version of what the liberal international order means? And whatever it is, will Putin gag on it?
Yeah, Putin will definitely gag on it, Jack. I have been looking just in the past couple of days at some of his statements, and over the past couple of months, I see the same pattern, which is an astonishing kind of ideological vehemence in the way Russian officials talk about liberalism, about events in the United States. And the hostility is really of a kind that I don't think I've seen before. It's not your garden variety sort of Russian assertion that, well, we do things a little differently here. It's very, very strident. You may be interested to know that that Putin is one of the biggest critics of what happened in the United States, in Washington on January 6th. But critical in this way. He says, you know what's happened after January 6th? They've taken people off social media platforms. They've denied access to Twitter. And he says, this is a sign of what the interference of the United States amounts to. They are going to try to treat us in exactly the same way. So this is reinforced in all kinds of other ways. For Putin, the ideological warfare that many people use to describe the current era as authoritarianism versus democracy. This is a really big thing. This is where he lives. I had for a time been more skeptical that he really believed this, but the way he talks these days, I think, puts him in a different kind of ideological universe. And I don't think you're going to find very much convergence between or attempt by the Biden administration to treat him as somebody who can be won over, the way we tended to think of other Russian leaders in the past 35 years or so. And that takes me, to a different kind of, conception of the liberal international order, which was one much more like the original conception and containment, which was a liberal international order in a divided world, in which containment meant essentially the success of Western societies and a long-term hope for the evolution of the Soviet system. I think conversion of Putin himself is a pretty remote prospect.
Well, thanks for sharing the bad news, Steve. Time to switch gears to some other bad news. Steve Biddle, we're coming up on the May 1 deadline for the decision about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. What should we do? The preconditions for withdrawal have not been met, but on the other hand, does soul searching suggest that it's warranted to continue to keep those troops deployed or not?
Yeah, I mean, the deadline stems from a bilateral negotiated agreement with the Taliban concluded about a year ago that arguably doesn't actually bind us because the Taliban haven't been observing their half of the deal, right? They pledged to start talks with the Afghan government. The deal itself was just between ourselves and the Taliban. It was not signed by the government of Afghanistan. They pledged to begin talks with the government of Afghanistan. They dragged their feet. That was delayed. They pledged to deny al-Qaeda any resources in Afghanistan and to deny any other terrorist organization, especially the Islamic State in Afghanistan, the resources of the country for terrorist activities. They haven't done either of those two things. If we want out of the deal, there's enough wiggle room created by the Taliban's failure to observe it that we could probably do it if we chose. The issue then is the one you posed. Do we so choose? Is it in our interest or not? And the issue there turns on what you think the talks between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan can actually accomplish. If you want the violence to end, right? If you want the war to stop and the killing to come to a conclusion, the talks are the only way that can happen. If the talks don't go anywhere, if they collapse, even if the Taliban manage to collapse the government of Afghanistan, that's not going to produce peace in the country. It's just going to produce 1990s style atomized civil warfare within n-dimensional cast of players. So if there's any hope for a better outcome than that, the talks are the only show in town. Now, you can make reasonable arguments that the prognosis for the talks is poor. The Taliban think they have the upper hand. The cliche is that the Westerners have the watches, but the Taliban has the time. If they want to, they can wait this out, not make any concessions, and eventually the government of Afghanistan will fall. If you take the view that what the Taliban are really doing is just waiting us out, then this is hopeless. Keeping a troop presence in Afghanistan, although it's cheap by contrast with the level of investment we had there in 2009, 2010, is still non-trivially expensive in absolute terms. If you think the talks are hopeless, then it makes sense to use the February 2020 agreement as a fig leaf, get all the way out, wash our hands of this whole problem, and allow Afghanistan to collapse into the scale of chaos that it will then do. That's a defensible position. It's not my own view, but it's a defensible position. My own view is that I think the Taliban actually are interested in some kind of settlement. They're not interested in a surrender instrument, right? It would require substantial concessions from our side to get them on board. But if they really weren't interested in a settlement at all, if they just wanted to play this string out, wait us out, let the government collapse, and then pick up whatever's left over at the end, there wouldn't be any negotiations of any kind at all. Where the Taliban have incurred significant political costs by beginning these talks. Anytime an insurgent organization begins negotiations with the government, it creates all sorts of centrifugal pressures within their own organization. There are fault lines between those who want to negotiate and those who don't, between factions who prefer this and factions who prefer that. The willingness of the Taliban to begin these talks has in fact created a spin-off splinter group of spoilers that are now waging war against them. The Islamic State in Afghanistan has virtually nothing to do with the Islamic State in Syria. It's basically a splinter group of the Taliban that opposes talks and is now busily killing Taliban fighters. So I think their demonstrated willingness to engage in negotiations suggests that, they're not going to surrender, but I think they want to see what's on offer. And if they're willing to see what's on offer, then we might get a deal that could actually end the violence. That would be substantially more to the interests of the United States, to the interests of millions of innocent Afghans, to the interests of Pakistan, Russia, others in the region. And given that the troop presence we're talking about now is like less than 3% in terms of US investment of what it was in 2009, 2010, my own preference would be to keep it in the country and use it as a bargaining chip and see if we can make these talks go somewhere.
So I read something just yesterday that may be complete malarkey, but the person's argument was that it's time for the US to bring in other states, India, China, Russia, states in the region, and help us somehow negotiate a way out of the quagmire, and by some combination of investments, diplomacy, greater sensitivity to the regional Fingerspitzengefühl, they will extricate us. Is this complete nonsense?
It might be malarkey. I don't know whether it's nonsense. Malarkey being the term of the hour after all these days. The outside powers matter a lot, but the outside power that matters more than any others by several orders of magnitude is Pakistan, right? It's not Iran, it's not China. And the India card is a favorite of some Americans that I really hope we decide not to try to play. A central part of the problem in Afghanistan for many, many years now has been that the Pakistanis' national security interests are deeply bound up with what goes on, on their western border. They are desperately concerned that the wrong kind of Afghan government could align itself with their existential rival, the Indians to their east, encircle Pakistan, leave it without strategic depth. And therefore, because they're afraid that we Americans are going to screw this up, sail in, blow up the Taliban government, which had been an ally of the Pakistanis, muck around a while, long enough to destroy a bunch of things, kill a bunch of people, and then bug out and go home, which we've done before, right? It's not a crazy supposition on the part of the Pakistanis. Therefore, they support the Taliban as a safety net and as a plan B. And therefore, if we're going to get a negotiated settlement, given the degree of Pakistani support for the Taliban, it's going to have to be one that the Pakistanis accept as in their self-interest. Therefore, some have argued, well, let's strong arm these Pakistanis to the point where they'll support a deal that we can live with by threatening to bring India into Afghanistan. And the trouble with that is that the Pakistanis go berserk over this prospect, right? That's a central part of the reason why they've been involved in this war at all, is to keep the Indians out. Their level of trust of us is somewhere below 0 degrees Kelvin. And there's a reasonable basis for that distrust, right? We've bollocksed this war up pretty impressively for quite some time now. The idea that we can threaten to bring India into the war if Pakistan doesn't play ball, but if they do play ball, we'll keep the Indians out, requires a willingness to believe that the Pakistanis trust us to manage this in a way that will not create the encirclement that is their worst case scenario in this whole problem from the get-go. I'm not confident that we could manage that in that kind of deft strategic way. B, I'm very confident that the Pakistanis don't think we can manage it that deftly. If either of those two conditions are the case, then bringing India into this problem will just cause Pakistan to become completely intransigent and blow up whatever prospect there was in the talks.
So I have one more question that I want to ask you that draws on your expertise in another part of the region, Iraq and Syria. And it's a gigantically big question. But I would like you to give your kind of succinct, off-the-cuff response to it. But it's something you hear a lot of people say. They say, well, the Gulf, the Middle East used to be a vital American interest, but now we have fracking. We're up to our ears in natural gas. We don't need their energy. In fact, we don't even really want to burn our own hydrocarbons into the atmosphere. Therefore, they argue, we don't need to expend blood and treasure fighting in places like Iraq. It's just not in our interest anymore. Is that an argument that's right, wrong, or sort of right?
Mostly wrong, but if it's mostly wrong, then it's sort of right. So you're drinking a glass that's half empty. So there's a strong version of that argument and a weak version of that argument. The strong version is not so impressive. The weak version has more to it, right? So the strong version is we're now energy independent, or we could be if we could just get Pennsylvanians fracking again. And once we become energy independent, we don't have to care about the energy markets. And the only reason we should care about the Middle East anyway is the energy markets. Well, there's several flaws with this argument. First of all, there are more reasons to care about the Middle East than just the energy markets, right? There's the small matter of one of the world's greatest humanitarian catastrophes on the planet unfolding in Syria. Is it really a good thing to have that spread across the region? Probably not. But then there's the particular way that it analyzes the energy markets themselves. So there was this famous metaphor in energy economics of the bathtub model of the oil market, right? So the oil market is this great big bathtub. Producers are putting oil into the bathtub, and then consumers take oil out of the bathtub. And it's the level of oil in the bathtub that determines the global price of oil. And it doesn't matter once it's in the bathtub, whether it came from Pennsylvania or Texas or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Australia. It's a global marketplace. Now, there are some exceptions to this, right? The sulfur level in some sources is higher than the sulfur level in other sources, and so on and so on. But to a first approximation, the global price of energy is affected by what happens in fracking in Pennsylvania, only to the degree that fracking in Pennsylvania changes how much oil is in the bathtub overall. And that level of oil in the bathtub overall affects a global economy that we hope to trade with and that we believe influences our own prosperity. So Americans could say, well, I don't care what happens in that Gulf Middle East. All a bunch of people I don't trust. And all I care about is whether Pennsylvania is producing enough, fracked oil to keep us going. And you can take that view if you want, and then watch US GDP decline as our ability to trade with a world in economic depression diminishes, right? Now, at the moment, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of other things, there's a glut, and the world price of oil is pretty low. So, the marginal effect of a little more in the bathtub or a little less in the bathtub on global prosperity as a whole is less than it would be normally. Hopefully the pandemic will end. If the pandemic ends and economic activity recovers, the demand for energy will go up and this issue will become somewhat more salient again. The weak version of the argument that has more going for it is that as non-Middle Eastern sources become more productive, fracking, tight oil extraction of various kinds in various parts of the world, then the marginal influence on the level of oil in the bathtub, from what happens in Iraq or what happens in Syria or Saudi Arabia or Iran for that matter, goes down. And therefore the degree of US concern with what happens there at the margin could reasonably diminish because the economic stakes of what happens there is diminished at the margin. But it's not going to go away unless the Middle East's influence on the world energy market as a whole, not US production per se, but as a whole, vanishes somehow. And I don't expect that to be likely anytime soon. So, the strong argument's not so strong. The weak version of the argument is more plausible, but it's important to keep this in the context of the global economy as a whole and not just US production.
Thanks, Steve. I see that Bob Jervis has his hand up. And since Bob, we invoked your name earlier in the meeting, that gives you the right of reply. So did you want to be recognized now, or did you want to be just at the head of the queue later? Your choice.
Yes, I jumped in to be the first when when the presentations are through.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that'll be pretty soon, because now we're moving along to Keren. And Keren, I thought I would start you off with the news peg issue of the day on U.S. overtures to revitalize discussions on the JCPOA. And some of the article that I read this morning made it seem pretty simple that the Biden people and the Iranians all want to get together somehow and get back towards this agreement, but each wants the other to make some move first. But I'm guessing that it's not that simple, and that there are both substantive issues where the two sides are still far apart, as well as there being political complications in Washington, D.C., in Israel, and in Iran. So tell us how to think about this complicated problem.
Right. So thank you for this question. So first of all, as someone who studies decision making in international politics, this is really an interesting moment, right? Is this deja vu all over again? We have almost the same actors that are meeting again to discuss the same issue and basically the same agreement that they already agreed on in the past. And so the question that I find interesting, it's a question of and it's an important question. What all the sides to this, and by the sides I mean the United States, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the European partners, right? What have they learned from the first interaction, right? What is this first round taught them, and are they learning? Has there been any learning about priorities, but also learning about strategies, right? And if this learning, if you look at those set of actors, is it going to help to further cooperation and reach an agreement now faster, or is it going to pull it apart and make it actually more difficult? And that to me is the basic question, right? Because the first round of playing this game is changing the realities that we have now. So we can't really just talk about going back to the same agreement because something happened, right? The United States pulled out, and as a result, Iran also reneged on its obligation. So the fact that we have the statement yesterday that, the announcement that Biden is going back to the negotiation table, that is not surprising. It's not surprising because this is something that he said he would do during the campaign. And it's not surprising is because Iran has taken some actions to force his hand. So they created some sort of a deadline for him. So what has happened? Just to kind of recap, right? We have Trump pulling out from the agreement in 2018. And then following that, we see Iran taking steps one by one to kind of breaking out from the agreement. So in the report from November 2020, that shows that Iran's stockpile of low enriched uranium increased by about 12 times the amount allowed under the JCPOA. And since Biden was elected, Iran has taken steps one by one to put pressure on the United States and the European allies to resume the talks. So there was legislation passed by the Iranian parliament back in December, I believe, that requires Iran to enrich uranium to 20%. And equally important, that's probably more important, is that a deadline in February 21st, I think, is a deadline by which Iran will limit its international inspectors and the access to its facilities unless sanctions are lifted. So that means that the inspectors in the country will kind of be cut by half compared to what we had in the past. So that was the deadline that Iran opposed. And then there was 2 weeks ago, there were also reports about Iran producing uranium metal. That something was very, much concern to Israel and European allies. So there is this kind of timeline that Biden was forced to kind of come back to the negotiating table. If it was totally up to him, between all the crises that he's facing, between the pandemic and the economic crisis and the racial crisis, that's not necessarily what he would have wanted to do. But we have an interesting situation where unlike in 2015, there are other domestic forces that are at play, and also strategic reality of COVID. So domestically, we have an interesting case happening also in Iran, where this whole thing about a negotiation over the JCPOA is playing alongside an election that are coming up for the presidential election that are coming up in June, where the relationship with the West, and especially the JCPOA, is a big part in the debate between the hardliners and the Rouhani kind of moderates. So the idea that we see this, that's not surprising that the Biden is there. Having said all this, I think that I think it was Anthony Blinken who said that the road ahead is long and the difficult decisions are ahead, right? And there are many decisions that the Biden administration will have to think about. It has a problem of credibility. And we have this problem of credibility that it is not just vis-a-vis Iran, because everything that the United States is going to do and has done, there are a lot of countries that are watching. And first among them that the United States cares about is North Korea. So it is important to kind of see how the United States is dealing with its credibility issue, not just vis-a-vis Iran, but other actors. There's also the credibility issue vis-a-vis regional allies. And what we know happened in the first time is that while the European allies were very pleased with this agreement, it's United States allies in the Middle East that were very, very concerned about what that agreement allowed Iran to do and what parts of the agreement stayed out of the agreement, which is Iran's regional behavior, the ballistic missiles, and the sunset provisions that were very dangerous from the perspective of Israel and Saudi Arabia. I think that of all of this, the issue of who goes first in terms of lifting sanctions versus coming back to the negotiation table, that seems to me that this is the easiest thing to solve to some extent. And I think that there's probably back channels already where this synchronization issue is going to be solved. The bigger issue is Biden going to go back to the playbook of 2015, or is the United States or is he going to try to go simultaneously for a stronger, longer lasting, more comprehensive agreement? That's the big question. And it is not clear because where he's heading, because there are also signals coming out of the administrations that are a little bit in tension with one another. Some in the administrations are talking about this agreement, the JCPOA, as being the agreement the United States want to go back to, full stop. And then there are some who said, no, Biden will go for a stronger agreement. There are other things that are going to be discussed, and it's not clear where Biden stands on this issue. So we have to kind of wait and see. It's a big dilemma, there are different forces and different pressures that will push in different directions.
Thanks, Keren. I have one more question for you about the Middle East. But although it's a complex question, I am encouraging you to give your punchy short answer because it'll be good to get to our audience questions as well.
Sure.
But so my question to you is a theme that has come up in several of the earlier parts of our discussion. So China is potentially very upset with Biden if he complains about the Uyghurs. Russia is potentially in an ideological struggle to the death with Biden if he keeps playing the liberal democracy card. So in the Middle East, we've recently seen Biden call Saudi Arabia a pariah. Yet Israel has recently, entered into, a warming relationship with Saudi Arabia. Is Biden going to so complicate his relations with states in the Middle East by being, more human rightsy than thou, that it's going to hinder his success on a bunch of the practical issues that are on the table?
Right. I mean, it's early to know. I mean, the short answer is that we don't know. There are some indications, right? Even if you think about who he called and who he hasn't called and when he called who, there is some signal that there is definitely diminished status for this kind of, even for Israel, that, right? I mean, this was very much a break from past presidents in terms of when he called Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that we have to also remember that this is not just a question for Biden. It's also a question about a strategy that the leaders in Saudi Arabia and Israel and their approach to this administration and what they have learned. Because I think that also will, it's a two-way street. And we will see this playing out first, I guess, with the JCPOA and the strategy that they will adopt towards the JCPOA, toward Biden as he negotiates. So for example, with Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, he has a real dilemma, right? Obviously, the strategy that he adopted in 2015 failed, and it failed miserably. Israel and the Iran issue became a partisan issue. And so the advice to kind of someone like Benjamin Netanyahu would be what it is that you're going to do this time to make sure that Biden listens, and also to make sure that there's no vacuum that is left in the Middle East, because that's what brought Israel and Saudi Arabia closer to begin with. I think the issue of how Benjamin Netanyahu is going to deal with it is a very interesting one. I think it will be a mistake to do a repeat of what he did in 2015. I think that the idea is not to, the best advice that people could give him is not to publicly, not to go publicly in opposition against the agreement. But at the same time, we do see some kind of going back to this playbook. We see the military chiefs of staff already making multiple statements that Israel is preparing for a military option, that it's requesting significant amount of funding to put together a military option. Israel has now Saudi Arabia and the Emirates as potential bases and partners to do this, something that did not happen in 2015. So there is this kind of real risk of doing a military action against Iran. So that all to say is that if you put it in the context of your question, there is signs that like Obama, the United States is pivoting. It might be still pivoting away from the Middle East, but it also could be going back to the first question about the learning. How much the United States have learned about leaving that vacuum in the Middle East as it did under Obama, and that remains to be seen.
Thanks so much, Keren. Okay, the floor is now open for questions from the audience. There are two ways to make your question known to us. Like Bob Jervis did, you could raise your hand, and if I see it, I'll call on you in your turn. If for some reason that's not working, or I'm not responding to your hand, you could also drop a note into the chat and let the staff know that you have a question you want to ask, and they will alert me to that. I can't read the chat myself probably because I can't read and chew gum at the same time. But so anyhow, while you're thinking about your question, first person recognized is the very patient Bob Jervis.
Thank you. Really great presentations. And my question, which is for all or any of you, goes back to Jack's introductory remarks. The panel is on foreign policy, but for Biden, what's primary is domestic politics, or domestic problems of the economy, pandemic, racial justice, etc., and domestic politics, even seeing that the Democrats don't lose control of Congress in 2022, getting legislation through an incredibly difficult Senate. So the question is twofold from that. First, how much time and attention is foreign policy going to get at the highest levels? Of course, Blinken and Sullivan can do quite a bit on their own, but really, I think Steve Sestanovich especially, or Tom would say, for many issues, it really takes presidential priority and attention. And is this going to be possible? And second, the deeper domestic sources. A number of scholars argue that the domestic support for liberal internationalism, no matter how we interpret it, has been badly eroded. And so when you think of many things we've talked about, it assumes a domestic politics polity being willing to be engaged and to somewhat provide some degree of public goods, or to at least make concessions to allies. And so the question is, on that deeper level of the domestic politics, will American domestic politics support an active foreign policy?
Yeah, this echoes the discussion about domestic politics, where there's the debate over whether the best strategy for the Biden administration and the Democrats is to be bold and show that amazingly liberals can govern, as opposed to the opposite view that no, you have to accommodate the handful of moderates, mainly on the Republican side, and the smaller handful of moderates on the Democrat side. But Steve and or Tom, do you want to chime in on this? Steve Sestanovich, your name.
I'll say a word about it.
Yeah.
Look, I think the idea that domestic politics take priority is not a new one. Almost any president of the past 75 years would have said the same. And I'll just give you two examples. Harry Truman was very mindful of the importance of not spending too much on defense, because he thought it'd be bad for the economy, and literally drove his Secretary of Defense to suicide by holding back on budget increases that the president thought would be, disadvantageous. Ronald Reagan, Bob Zellick did a session with us a few weeks back at SEPA, in which he reminded us that Reagan's first year priority was economic recovery, economic recovery, economic recovery. He really didn't talk very much or make many initiatives on foreign policy in the first year. Didn't go to Europe for a year and a half. So I think this is going to be, in some ways, rather familiar. The president will be trying to empower his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense. I suspect Bill Burns will be on that CIA director's plane a lot. And Biden is somebody who has a lot of confidence in these people and will try to empower them.
Yeah, Bob, I just add to what Steve said. I think that domestic politics are going to be like first, second, and third in the first few months of the administration, but some issues are pressing. So a proper view of the pandemic will lead to foreign policies related to the pandemic, but I'm a little nervous that you won't necessarily get that proper view of the pandemic. I keep hearing things like 300 or 400 million vaccines, which is the language of the Trump administration being repeated in the Biden administration, which is really about inoculating American adults. And that's not going to solve the problem, as we see from the South African variant. We have to have a global approach. Let's just hope that they come around to that and they're able to convince Americans that it's in your self-interest to see shots in the arms of Africans and Latin Americans. The second thing is the one that Keren raised. My understanding from public reports is that the first really serious discussions that we've had with the Chinese were about Iran. And Iran, because of its production of enriched uranium, is making it an urgent issue. So there'll be issues that come up that have to be dealt with urgently. And in those cases, you'll see discussions between Washington and Beijing, Washington and the European capitals, probably Washington and Moscow too. That'll just be driven by events. But I do think domestic politics is king. And to get back to Jack's point, and that was a point in my initial presentation, I'm very concerned by this bipartisan consensus that somehow the United States has been severely damaged by international economic arrangements in the past, whether it be the WTO, whether it be NAFTA, whether it be potential TPP. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's defensible through evidence in a persistent way, but it's incredibly well accepted. And I think it will really limit, and where the rubber is going to hit the road, it's going to really limit these efforts to rebuild the relationships with the European allies and the Asian allies and the many partners in Asia who are not quite allies, but are really important to US power projection, like Singapore. It's just going to be very hard to do that when you don't talk economics, because you have a kind of traditional protectionist bent in your view of these things.
Thanks, Tom. Bob, I believe, had his hand up for a rebuttal. Yes or no? No. Oh, okay. All right. Next question is from Susan Olds. Susan Olds, unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, thank you. I had sent it in the chat. My question is regarding the Afghanistan policy. What role do women play in determining that policy, the status of women in Afghanistan? How much is that taken into account in this decision-making about what's going to happen with the agreement that's on the table?
It's one of a collection of aspirations the United States has for the country that we will probably require greater resources if we are serious about realizing. Right? So there's a negotiation going on that has a bargaining space associated with it. One of the issues within that bargaining space is civil rights within Afghanistan. The Taliban have a much more restrictive view than the current government does. The United States has a more liberal view than either of the above. If we want a settlement to move in our direction and not in the Taliban's direction, we have to have bargaining leverage. There are only two plausible sources of bargaining leverage in these talks: promise of post-war aid and the US troop presence. The US troop presence has gone radically down since 2009, from 100,000 to 2,500 today. The promise of post-war aid is still there. My guess is that the congressional prospects for that aid are probably also diminishing. So we have this odd tension where especially, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would very much like to see the rights of Afghan women respected. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party also wants to see lower military investment and a smaller foreign aid budget for Afghanistan. And you can't get those things at the same time, right? If you want the leverage to defend Afghan women, you have to provide it and pay for it. And I would personally favor that. Many of the people who most want forceful effort on behalf of Afghan women are less in favor of what would be required to get it.
Is there no role for diplomacy?
But this is diplomacy. Diplomacy is about negotiation. Negotiation requires leverage. I mean, that this is a fundamentally diplomatic conversation. I am skeptical that the diplomacy, i.e. a negotiated settlement, will go forward on terms that we will find congenial if we continue to keep unilaterally reducing our leverage in the talks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Next up, Professor Cynthia Roberts.
Oh, thank you, Jack. I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. So since I agree mostly with what Steve Sestanovich said about Russia and don't see much progress there beyond strategic stability talks, which I believe and hope the Biden team will pursue, except in the one respect, maybe he wants to comment on Russia's relations, particularly military relations with China, which short of alliance can still cause us a lot of problems. But my question really is directed to Tom, since I have to teach China courses nowadays. And here, I couldn't agree more. I mean, wearing a guns and money hat, I completely agree with you that the biggest problem is less immediately security issues, but most importantly, the economic issues. And it's not just Iran that is China's largest trading partner. It is, or vice versa, it is all of our partners and allies in the region are larger trading partners with China than with us. And that's not sustainable. And yet, if you look at the administration's policy, and here's my question, even today, President Biden was speaking about things like working with our allies on corporate governance structures. This is a worthy cause, trying to bring better standards and enforcement on a host of issues. But the real issue is trade. The real issue, we've lost markets. The real issue is we're not there. And it goes back to the first question on two-level games in domestic politics. My question to you is, I don't see the Biden team leading with that, probably because they don't have the support in their domestic coalition. And if that's the case, then they can work these other issues while pursuing the security, sort of defending our platforms at the same time. But we're going to get nowhere on the big question of trade. Do they see it wrong, or is it they're just trying to build support for it? Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Great question as always. I think there are people in the administration who get it. I don't want to name names, who understand that things like the TPP negotiations from the Obama administration dovetailed with the desire to quote unquote pivot to Asia and build strong security relationships. They saw them all pulling in the same direction. But I don't know if those voices are dominant. And there have been noises at a very high level on the foreign policy team suggesting that these earlier deals were harmful to American workers and harmful to the US. What I could, if I want to give you an optimistic scenario, and here's where, the United States is not the only actor in the world, and we have to remember that. Our allies will be talking to the Biden officials. Japan has really stuck its neck out to create this truncated TPP with the neighbors. Japan has been involved in the other regional negotiations. The EU signed a bilateral investment treaty. So it's not all trade, there's also investment. And investment gets a bad name in the United States because you're quote unquote offshoring jobs. I think this is a very simplistic view of global economics and the benefits that the United States has enjoyed from it. But I think there are people in the administration, people who really care about the alliance system in Asia and who are in very powerful positions, who will try to make the case that to have a robust relationship with our allies that will really pose a strong front for China to try to shape China's choices in a more positive direction, we're going to have to have a strong economic component to our diplomacy. And I hope that wins the day, because there is this tension between those two groups. And it seems like it's kind of going that way in domestic policy. If you want to get anything done, you have to talk about China. So now they're saying, we need to build infrastructure in the United States. Well, of course we need to build infrastructure. We have to do it because otherwise we can't compete with China. So I think everything's going to be pitched this way. It's not quite a Sputnik moment, which you've studied, but it's something that almost everything can be tied to competition with China in a way that sells it, even if it's not otherwise popular.
So we have a few questions in the chat about triangular diplomacy among Russia, China, and the United States. Shades of the old glory days of Henry Kissinger. And the presumption in the questions is that with Biden putting pressure on Russia, pressure on China, isn't the logical move that Russia and China will move closer together, cooperate on security issues, energy, what have you. Is this a problem for the Biden administration? And if so, what's their best move to alleviate it? So Steve and Tom, each take a crack at this one.
You go first, Steve.
Okay. Look, I think the difference between the Kissinger opportunity is that the Soviet Union and China had terrible relations then. And so there was much more opportunity for the United States to exploit that. Right now, Russia and China have too many reasons to have good relations that don't have anything to do with their bad relations with us. China's a huge energy market. It's a huge market for military technical cooperation. They have a kind of ideological affinity. There are plenty of reasons for them to do that. So, and Putin has a policy toward China that I would, in a value neutral way, call appeasement. So he's not going to give up on that easily. But it is a real issue. If one were thinking about, a multipolar world, you would rather not have Russia and China too closely aligned. But I wouldn't start with trying to break up their relationship. I would start the move you ask for by trying to show the Russians that you've already got a pretty good anti-China balancing bloc, that it then becomes more attractive for them to join, but probably that will be in a tacit way. I think that Russians are likely to be the last country that wants to join it, although they in some ways may want it to succeed.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. I think that the China-Russia relationship is well short of an alliance, but it's of concern to the United States for the reasons that Cynthia laid out. It's not an alliance, and I always test people on this. Can you imagine Chinese forces fighting in Eastern Europe alongside Russian forces over something like Ukraine? No. Could you imagine the Russian fleet being involved in a Taiwan crisis with China? No. But they share technology and they share diplomacy. In large part, what really brings them together, in my mind, is the kind of bipartisan traditional position of the United States in support of the spread of democracy around the world in the form of color revolutions, et cetera, have really brought Moscow and Beijing together. Moscow is much more anti-democratic and actively anti-democratic in its foreign policy than China is. But both of them are actively defensive against US or EU promoted color revolutions. They both believe these are dangerous for the countries in question, and they believe they're dangerous eventually for Moscow and Beijing themselves. And I would guess, all things, it makes me somewhat pessimistic. I would guess that Russia and China are going to get closer together in the near term, because the Biden administration actually believes in the traditional US policy of democracy spread in a way that the Trump administration didn't. And in addition, for all the reasons Steve laid out, and I would put a little bit more emphasis on the bitterness over 2016 than he did, I expect the Biden administration to be really tough on Russia, and as a result, pushing them closer to China, in part because of the anger over the 2016 election, which I think is still raw with a lot of top officials in the Biden administration.
This is Zuma camera.
Tom, would you say that that the Biden administration believes in the democracy promotion abroad mission, not only more than Trump, which is an easy thing, but even more than the Biden administration? Is that a
Even
fair-
more than the Obama administration, you mean?
sorry, the Obama administration, yeah.
I know. I think most Americans believe in democracy promotion. I think most Americans, by the international relations literature, are revisionists. I think revisionism gets a bad name. Revisionist is bad. You're overturning this peaceful status quo. Most Americans are revisionists. I'm a revisionist. I confess in front of all of you. I believe in the promotion of democracy. I think democracy is good for the world and good for America, and it's the right thing to do. The question is how you do it. How active are you? My sense with the Obama administration is they made some real fumbles in places like Libya and Syria and how they actually executed their hopes and desires. That probably led to a lot more suffering that needed to occur, and also led to a lot more problems for U.S. foreign policy. I'll just list two of them really quickly. One of them is Libya, and it can't be overstated how important the killing of Gaddafi was for the non-proliferation efforts of the United States moving forward. This guy gave up his nuclear weapons because he got caught by the Bush administration red-handed, gave up his nuclear program, and as soon as the United States had a chance, the United States and the NATO allies got him killed. And a lot of people raise it for cynical reasons that are not really heartfelt on the international stage, but they raise them, and they raise them in a convincing fashion, which is, how can you expect the Iranians and the North Koreans to give up their weapons when you literally take out the leaders who do so? And they may not actually believe that, but it's a way of fending off the US. The US is always asking countries like China to pressure North Korea, to pressure Iran. And they said, we don't need to pressure them, you need to lighten up. Because what you do is you kill people when they cooperate with you. And that was hugely consequential. And that had to do with the Arab Spring and the color revolutions as well. And then in Syria, it's been a wreck. I don't think we had a real plan there. I'm not an expert on the region, but I don't get the impression that we really knew what we wanted to happen after we armed some professors who believed in democracy to fight the state. I don't think we really had a plan there.
Okay, well, that's your upbeat take home from this session. Everybody just lighten up. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sorry for the people who wrote excellent questions in the chat that we didn't get to. Very grateful to our brilliant panelists, and also appreciative to the sponsors, the Saltzman Institute and the China and the World program. So thank you all very much.
And thank you, Jack, for moderating, and for Bob Jervis for coming up with the idea for this panel. And so this is next Friday, we have a Saltzman event. This year we've had Saltzman events every Friday. So if it's a Friday, it's a Saltzman event. So next week we have the panel on COVID, and I put it on the chat, and you're all welcome to join us. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great
Thanks,
weekend.
Karen.
Thank you.